Welcome to a Point San Pedro Road Coalition event. I'm Winifred Dejani, chairperson of the Wetlands Committee, and I'll be moderating tonight's event, Why Healthy Wetlands Are Important, Restoration Success Stories, with our guest speaker, Julian Wood of Point Blue Conservation Science. The Wetlands Committee wants its webinars to raise community awareness about these very special ecosystems we have in our neighborhood, the wildlife that lives there, and why it's important that they be healthy. This webinar is part of an ongoing series our committee has been featuring, and past webinars such as Wetlands 101 and Wintering Birds in the San Pablo Bay are recorded and we're posted on our YouTube site, which is a wonderful resource to go in and see not only the recordings of past wetlands events, but also of events and webinars about all different types of topics that the coalition has sponsored. And I also urge you to go to the website, sprcoalition.org, because it's a good way to keep up to date on current events. We have a lot of historical background archive there, and it's just overall a great resource for the community, our local community. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Julian Wood. Julian has spent many years in varied regions studying bird ecosystems, that's his passion, and supervising projects focused on bird response to riparian restorations. As the San Francisco Bay program leader for Point Blue Conservation Science, Julian works to promote conservation actions that not only address climate change, but also land use change in ways that benefit human and wetland bird communities throughout the Bay Area. And we're so pleased to have him with us here tonight. And he's going to speak about the significance of wetlands and how they can be restored. So I am going to turn the floor over to Julian, and here's Julian.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Winifred, and to the coalition. Thank you for the great introduction. And yeah, happy to be here. Wish we could all be here in person, but such is the way. So I'm going to be talking to you about why healthy wetlands are important in San Francisco Bay, and show you some restoration success stories as well. So just to kind of get right into it, some of my key messages are that that's what I hope I can convince you of, that San Francisco Bay is really an important place for wetland birds, and that sea level rise really threatens the bay's biodiversity, and in particular, wetland habitat and wetland birds. But that restoration and nature-based adaptation to sea level rise can really benefit birds and human communities. So that's going to kind of be the focus of my talk. Now, those are some big topics. I won't go into too much detail on each of these, but hope to provide you a good kind of overview of this. So real quick, just about me. This is a photo of me down here. This is what my family and friends think I do all the time, every day, out there in the wild counting birds. But most of the time I'm at my computer, probably like many of you. But yeah, I lead bird monitoring projects and research projects aimed at understanding bird population trends and habitat needs. And I use our results to advocate for improved restoration and management of the bay's shoreline and wetland habitats. And so I've sort of about a little on my background, I've always been attracted to wetlands. Kind of when I was growing up in Michigan, kind of just exploring lakes and ponds was, I really enjoyed that. And I was always curious about what drove the different, population cycles that I saw in those areas. And I feel really lucky that I still get to do that now, albeit in a much bigger pond. But yeah, I'm really lucky. I came to Point Blue as an intern in 1996. back then it was called the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, and have worked for other folks kind of in those early days, but kind of kept coming back to what is now Point Blue. And now, as Winifred said, the San Francisco Bay program leader. So let's get on. I want to take a kind of a step back and really talk about sort of the Bay as a whole, and why, and just how important it really is. So it's designated as a bay of hemispheric importance for shorebirds. And this is because over 1 million shorebirds use San Francisco Bay on an annual basis, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. A lot of those birds move on to breed. They're only here for a brief time before they move on to breed in places to the north, but some of them actually do stay here. And it's also a Ramsar designated wetland of international importance, in part for the tens of thousands of waterfowl that spend the winter in SF Bay. And so this is a really important place for them for gathering energy for their migration and their breeding, again, further north. And you probably heard some about that on one of the previous webinars, highlighting waterfowl in San Pablo Bay. So it's really this habitat mosaic that's so important and so unique to San Francisco Bay. It's this tapestry of different habitats, some of them natural, some of them managed, that makes San Francisco Bay a really important place for so many birds. And these are some of the habitats here that I'm going to really quickly kind of go over. These are all shallow water habitats. And of course, being shallow water habitats basically at more or less around sea level, they're very threatened by sea level rise. And many of these areas are just protected by low earthen levees, just dirt piled up simply, non-engineered levees that could be easily overtopped by sea level rise, and they're getting increasingly costly to maintain. So they're really at risk. So some of these habitats are subtidal habitats. Now these are technically right below the water level, but they still can be impacted by sea level rise as water gets deeper, the wave energy increases, and you don't have as much light for the plants that grow in this habitat in that zone. And that can be pretty disastrous for birds like the black oyster catcher and sea ducks and other birds that forage in these kinds of shallow waters. Another important habitat are the tidal flats. I just mentioned the 1 million shorebirds. This is largely what they're depending on, what they're feeding on. They feed on invertebrates that live in the soft mud. And so you have species like this black-bellied plover. I think you guys can all see my cursor, but yeah, black-bellied plover here, and the dunlin behind it. You know, the least sandpipers over here. They all rely on tidal flats during their migration to fatten up and be healthy for when they hit the breeding grounds. So some of the other shorebirds, like stilts and avocets, they actually breed here. So we do have some breeders. And of course, we can't forget the raptors, who don't feed in the mud, but rather feed on the shorebirds that are on these tidal flats. So they're also an important part of the bird community here. So San Francisco Bay was really designated not just for the shorebirds and the waterfowl, but really many other species. I'm only showing a few here, but each of these species has a different specific habitat need and preference within these shallow water habitats, and all of these are being met in the estuary. So in terms of protecting these species and planning big restorations and planning nature-based adaptations on the landscape, we really need to be considering the needs for all of these species so that we can maintain that amazing diversity that we have here in the Bay. So now I'm going to get on to my, I'll just say it's my favorite habitat type, tidal marsh. This is where I spend most of my time, and talk a little bit about what makes it so special. So tidal marshes, they sequester carbon. So that's really important in fighting climate change. They also filter pollutants. many say they're the lungs of the bay. Probably more like kidneys in that sense, but it doesn't really sound the same to say kidneys of the bay, so it doesn't quite have the same ring. So, but you know your audience best, however you want to talk about it. Tidal marshes are also like a sponge. They really can absorb and slow down floodwaters. So in that way, they're a really important piece in flood protection, in natural flood protection. So this photo here, this is of a marsh in the North Bay, a restored marsh actually. But the bay was once ringed with marshes that looked like this, pretty much all the way around the bay. But we've lost over 80% of those historic sort of pre-settlement tidal marshes. And most has been lost to development, agriculture, grazing. These marshes were, levees were built around them, and then the water was drained out, and then they were farmed or developed or even just used as garbage dumps. They just really weren't valued at all. They were considered a wasteland. Which is really sad, because they also provide a habitat for lots of birds and fish and mammals. And we'll look at some of those. So for example, these are some of our study species. And all of these birds that I'm showing pretty much live their entire lives within tidal marsh habitat. So they grow up here, they breed here, they spend all of their time, they forage in this habitat. This is the California black rail. This is a state threatened species that relies on tidal marsh habitat here in the bay. There are some small populations in the foothills, but the bulk of the population is right here in San Francisco Bay in tidal marsh habitat exclusively. I should also say this bird is the sneakiest, skulkiest bird I've ever come to know. I've only seen 2 in my whole career of working in tidal marshes, which seems a little crazy, because I've heard probably hundreds, if not thousands. But yeah, they really stay deep in dense vegetation and do not come out. Another species is Ridgway's rail. This was formerly known as the clapper rail, and there's an endemic subspecies, the California Ridgway's rail, that only occurs in San Francisco Bay and only in tidal marsh habitat, nowhere else. And that's federally endangered species. And then we have also common yellowthroat and song sparrow. These are 2 endemic subspecies. Actually, there's 3 endemic subspecies of song sparrow that live throughout the bay. And again, they live and breed and live their entire lives in tidal marsh habitat. And then finally, the marsh wren. So this one also is part of the tidal marsh bird community. So these are our focal species. So when I'm talking and presenting results, I'll be showing results on these species here. So let's see, what else can I say about tidal marshes? I think you got the primer on the wetlands already, so I won't go into too much detail, but just a very kind of quick summary. Tidal marshes are basically sit right around the mean high tide line, like right at sea level. And so that's what makes them really susceptible to sea level rise. But tidal marshes, one unique thing about them, which is great, is that they are dynamic, and they can actually move. They can change their elevation and kind of move with sea level rise. So as sea level rise increases, if there's enough sediment to build up that marsh surface, it can keep pace with sea level rise. Now, the question is to what extent and what level of sea level rise is going to be too much for these tidal marshes to keep pace. And so we've done some modeling on that. I'll show you some results a little bit later. But since we don't know exactly how fast sea level rise is going to happen, we don't know exactly how well these marshes are going to persist. In like the most pessimistic scenarios, we might very well lose 90% of our marshes in San Francisco Bay, unless we can do something about it. You know, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there are ways to feed sediment, feed these marshes with sediment. Okay. So yeah, so what's going to happen with these habitats with sea level rise, and as well as all the bird species that that depend on them? Just to kind of give you a sort of look at what, or a sense of what that looks like. So this is a tidal marsh that normally this would be just complete covered in dense, thick vegetation like that previous photo, but this is during a king tide, and you can see almost all of this vegetation is completely covered in water. And so scenes like this will become more and more frequent in the future as sea levels rise and as storms become more intense and more frequent. So birds like the ridgeways rail, as waters rise, they just don't have as many places to hide from predators. And so that's one of the big problems. And since they also nest directly in the marsh, usually around anywhere from like ankle height to knee height, basically just above, they try to nest just above that high tide line. You know, so their nests also can be susceptible to flooding. So yeah, so these birds are really in trouble with sea level rise. They just simply don't have many places to go. And so here's another shot. They are pretty well camouflaged, and so they kind of require this kind of taller, dense vegetation in order to hide. And this is also during a king tide out at Muzzy Marsh. And when they don't have any place to hide, need to get from one place to another, they will swim if they have to. Obviously, that makes them very susceptible to predators. So, talked a little bit about birds and how they're susceptible, but it's not just birds that are threatened by sea level rise, right? Human communities are also threatened by sea level rise. And it's a big question as to how are we going to respond to this? Obviously, no one has any easy answers. You know, will we put up, so here's a photo here of the king tide at China Camp, which you guys are all familiar with, I'm sure. And here there isn't even a threat of immediate, you know, housing next to it, but in many areas there is. So how are we going to respond to this? One way to respond would be to just put up seawall. They're tempting, short-term solution, but they tend to increase the flood risk for adjacent communities because all that wave energy gets deflected onto other areas. And also, when they fail, and invariably they do fail, it's pretty catastrophic. So we could do this, and also it's not very pretty to look at. You know, who wants to have a bay path with this in the way of their view? Now, granted, in some areas, this kind of is the only solution. But my point here that I'm going to try to make in my talk is that we really need to think very critically about where we use this kind of solution versus a more nature-based solution. So yeah, so we can look ahead, we can consider the whole picture, the greater landscape, and really think about these other solutions, nature-based solutions, and where they can be implemented. And then importantly, how tidal restoration can be a big part of those nature-based solutions. So again, I'm not going to get into too many details. There's a lot of site-specific constraints that has to be taken into account. But my point is that these should be considered along with more traditional methods. And they're usually not because they're new and people don't know about them very well yet. So going back to the tidal restoration, so it's really one of the key solutions that can benefit both people and wildlife. So I'll talk a little bit about tidal restoration. So this is a photo of a North Bay site, Sears Point, that was breached. When was that? Maybe 7, 8 years ago. I don't remember exactly. But yeah, so in doing this, creating these marshes, they can really help slow down tidal waters. They can absorb a lot of that tidal water, and really help buffer the adjacent communities from the rising seas. So, and we are lucky here in the Bay, I have to say, that the Bay community continues to support efforts to keep the bay healthy and clean. And so we've invested in a lot of protection and restoration of tidal marsh. So we have made some great progress in terms of getting back some of that tidal marsh that we've lost. Here's another example of how quickly tidal restoration can work when the conditions are just right. This is an aerial shot from the South Bay showing how quickly that can happen. So if the sediment is there to build up that marsh surface, and you've got good tidal flows, and the starting elevation, which is really important, is relatively high, then the marsh can come back very quickly. For sites that were diked off and drained and in particular farmed, those sites tend to be more subsided. So the elevation is even lower than mean sea level. Those are going to take more time to accrete and build up before the marsh vegetation starts to colonize. So one of the questions for us, excuse me, is, so the vegetation comes back, but do the birds come back as well? Do these restored marshes perform the same functions as, say, an ancient marsh? So here's where we can apply our science to find out. So just a real quick overview here of our science. Over the last 27 years, we've been counting birds in the variety of tidal marsh, different age tidal marsh. And at first, we wanted to determine the status of those endemic birds that I showed you in that earlier slide. We wanted to know how many were out there. Were there populations going up or going down? Did they warrant extra protections? So we kind of answered a lot of those questions. And now we're using our data and continuing these surveys to help answer questions like where and how can we best restore tidal marsh to benefit these birds? And how can tidal marsh be a part of this nature-based adaptation? So I'll show you some results on how birds respond to tidal marsh. But first, I wanted to show you, so this is someone doing the survey, the tools of the trade. You've got your binoculars. My background's kind of preventing it from showing up, but an important piece. And of course, we still take our data on old-fashioned, with old-fashioned pen and paper. So you probably can't, no, it's not gonna let me because I've got my mask on. But anyway, real live data sheet in action there. We also use rangefinders. So this helps me estimate the distance to the birds that I'm detecting. And so that's part of how we can estimate the density. We need to know how far away the bird is. So we're pretty good at estimating, but we can use this to make sure. So yeah, just some tools of the trade there. So this, I should point out, this map is a map of all our study sites. So we don't do all of these in every year, but we have visited collected data at all of these sites throughout the bay. Okay, results. So yes, restoration does work. The birds do come back. We're kind of lucky, I think, in that sense, because I'm sure that you have all heard of, and the literature is full of accounts of wetland restorations not going very well, just being very difficult to do, mostly inland kind of freshwater restoration. But here in the bay, it's actually quite successful. So this graph here, we have density, song sparrow density on the y-axis, and then the number of years since that tidal breach restoration event down here. So this is the marsh age, basically. And so we see this nice relationship as the tidal marsh restoration evolves and that marsh gets older. We have more birds populating that site. So pretty exciting. So it takes time. They don't show up right away. But in the end, and this is an average of all of the restoration sites, it is successful. And then, so that's for the song sparrow. We see a a similar pattern with the Ridgway's rail. They take a little bit longer. They don't tend to show up at sites on average around between 15 and 20 years. And again, each site is a little bit different. So this isn't like a, you know, that doesn't apply necessarily to all sites. But in general, they do come back. So even this, you know, highly endangered species, it's super specialized in tidal marsh habitat, will use these restored habitats. So it's pretty exciting. And to answer kind of that original question of like, do these restored marshes provide the same functions? We're still investigating that, but it does seem like some of these restored sites, the densities are pretty comparable to mature sites. So that's definitely encouraging. This is just looking at, you know, number of birds. We could also look at reproductive success, which again might differ a little bit with between restored and mature. But in general, we're seeing these restored sites on a trajectory to meet with mature sites. So very cool. I might have to kind of breeze through this one. It sort of takes a lot of explaining, but the sort of the high level here is that we've also used our bird data along with marsh accretion data and other GIS layers to make a map, this map, of restoration prioritization. So these darker areas represent areas that are both important for birds, whole diversity of birds now in the present, and are likely to be resilient to sea level rise in the future. So we can use this map to see, okay, where are the areas where for sure we need to protect, you know, protect existing habitat, but also where can we restore habitat that is likely to be resilient in the future. So I won't get into too much detail, but I do want to, we're going to zoom into Point San Pedro here. Oh, and I should point out, this is China Camp Marsh, right? So that's coming up. The darker colors are the higher priority because it's an existing marsh. Same with McInnes up here to the north. But yeah, so kind of looking at the circled area. So this area, if it were open to tidal action, would be a really high priority wetland. Now I know it's a golf course, it's unlikely to become, you know, to become a wetland restoration site, but it just kind of helps you visualize what the landscape could be and where the opportunities are given site-specific constraints. And you can see the that Dutra wetland is kind of tucked in here, could also be as well high priority wetland to restore. Let's zoom into the smaller circle here. This is the Glenwood Elementary School. This site's kind of interesting. Went on a tour with some folks from your organization, and yeah, it's an interesting little. There's some wetlands back in there that could make it for a really good restoration site. Anyway, trying not to spend too much time here. This map is showing. It's an elevation-based map, and this green area is showing where the elevation that could support tidal wetland habitat. So this area here is not tidal wetland currently because it's restricted. The tidal flows are restricted. So it's more like a what if kind of a scenario. If the connections to this creek here were reformed and tides were allowed to flow into the site or into this creek down here, then this green area would become very quickly tidal marsh habitat because it's just at that right elevation. And again, site-specific constraints might not be easy to do this. I don't know, but just sort of another way of visualizing the landscape. So yeah, so that's that tidal marsh area. And then, so this is from our Future Marshes viewer, which I'll show you a link in a minute. We can fast forward 100 years into the future under a kind of a, I guess now it's sort of an upper end of a rate of sea level rise. What would the landscape look after 100 years of relatively high sea level rise? So now we see it quite different. This is the original marsh area. But as sea level rise has risen so much that area is now inundated and sort of has transitioned into a mudflat area. So it still supports shorebirds, but maybe not tidal marsh birds. But the tidal marsh has moved into this higher ground adjacent. So here we have like essentially marsh migration. The marsh was able to move from that low spot where it got inundated and slowly transition to this higher ground. And so areas like these are really rare around the bay. And there just aren't many places like that. Even in places you would think that are natural, like China Camp, no development in the upland. The hillsides are rather steep, and there's not that much opportunity for sea level rise to move into, except for some of the meadow areas. So yeah, so that's kind of my main point. But again, site-specific constraints. You'd have to make sure that this neighborhood was reasonably well protected if you were to open tides on the back end here. Anyway, so yeah. So let's see what else. Oh, here's a photo of what that site looks like. So you can see already there are some wetland plants here. These cattails, kind of in the center there. So there is a little bit of connection happening, but not quite enough for a healthy tidal marsh. And here's another site, a little bit to the south there, near the I think it's Bay Way. This marsh is interesting and could benefit from a full tidal connection as well. This is a highly muted marsh. So this area right here is kind of really the only tidal portion. And again, it's very muted. And this upper area here is mostly uplands. And that's because there's a barrier here to a full tidal connection. But if that were opened, this site would almost immediately become tidal marsh, because it's right at the correct elevation. And by opening it, it would also help that tidal marsh sustain or keep pace with sea level rise, because with that full tidal connection, you get all the sediment coming back in, depositing on the surface, and building up the surface of that marsh. So again, I'm not going to show what that looks like in the tool, but you can explore that tool and see what it looks like under different rates of sea level rise and different sediment concentrations. Okay, another thing, I should have mentioned at the Glenwood Elementary School, one of the things we can do, because breaching that area, that's a pretty big project. We require quite a lot of work if it was even feasible. But what we can do is restore the transition zone around the edges of that area. And by transition zone, I mean the habitat that sits between tidal marsh habitat and upland. So it just gets very infrequent inundation from that salt water. And there's a very specific plant community that occupies that narrow band. And that's one of the things in my next slide here that our STRAW program specializes in, is restoring these transition zones. STRAW stands for Students and Teachers Restoring a Watershed. They also do riparian work too, throughout the bay and other places too. So here's a quick example of where some of that transition zone restoration is happening at Tiscornia Marsh. I think it's also called the Pickleweed Park. But this is the area where the STRAW program has been focusing, kind of along the levee. Often it's really only along these levees where you get that transition zone, because the areas adjacent to the marshes have been developed. There are a few natural areas left, like at China Camp, some areas in Sassoon, but most of the transition zone in the bay is along levees. But restoring those areas can still be beneficial, and I'll show you some of those results. But they've been out there for 8 years, and they've involved 787 students, planted 865 plants. So they've done a lot of work. And here's some 5th graders working hard, restoring the bay. So I'm gonna try to go quickly here. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. So we did a special project to look at transition zone habitat specifically. because we hadn't really done that before. We'd mostly been focused on just the marsh. But the straw program folks who are leading that said, yeah, how much does it benefit the tidal marsh birds that we're restoring, these levees? And I said, I don't know. I looked in the literature. There was really no information on this at all. So we decided to pilot a project. And so these are some of the results of that, looking at that project. And it was a little bit tricky too, because we're looking at birds that live in the tidal marsh, but are benefiting from a habitat that's not, that's adjacent. And what we found was, in fact, that yes, that habitat that's adjacent to the tidal marsh is really important for those tidal marsh birds. In addition to some species that only use that transition zone, like American goldfinch and other species like that. But specifically, it helps the tidal marsh birds. And that's what this graph shows. As the width of that transition zone increases, so levee slopes kind of go from steep to more gradual, and that width increases, we see a benefit to ridgeways rails. Those populations are increasing more rapidly in places with wider levees. And also we looked at dense vegetation over 30 centimeters. So it's kind of like knee-high vegetation. The presence of that dense native vegetation in the transition zone was also beneficial to tidal marsh species. So that was really cool, and kind of really gave them, got them pretty excited about continuing their restoration work. So kind of wrapping it up here, talked about flood protection and the importance of an important bird habitat not being mutually exclusive. In fact, they can complement each other because tidal marshes can buffer wave energy. And we've also seen that these wider levees that are restored with native vegetation can really benefit tidal marsh birds. And also the importance of uplands in accommodating sea level rise. So again, where tidal marshes don't quite have enough sediment to keep pace vertically, they're going to have to move laterally into uplands. And those are very scarce. So wherever we can find those and protect those and prepare those areas for that eventual marsh migration, that's what we need to do. And your group is definitely super important for doing that, because it's all going to happen at a local level for sure. And here's one of the resources that I didn't quite have enough time to dig into, but it talks a little bit, shows you how to do this nature-based adaptation, how to go about creating these projects. And luckily for you, the case study for this adaptation project was Marin County. So I encourage you to look at that, and you can see what some of the project ideas are for your community or adjacent communities. So with that, hopefully I've convinced you that San Francisco Bay is a really important and special place for wetland birds, and that those birds are really threatened by sea level rise. But that restoration and nature-based adaptation to sea level rise can really benefit birds and human communities. So with that, I will say thank you and turn it back over to Winifred for questions.
Thank you, Julian. That was so interesting and encouraging. And we are taking questions in the chat. I have a few here. I have somebody that says she loves hearing the song sparrows when she's out walking, and it was really interesting to find out that they're endemic to this particular area. Does that mean that you don't find song sparrows anywhere else, or is it just a particular type of song sparrow that is endemic?
Just a particular type. Sorry if I didn't make that clear, but it's an endemic subspecies of song sparrow. And there are 3 of them, 3 different subspecies around the bay. And the San Pablo song sparrow is one of those.
Oh, okay.
So it's and there's one in the Alameda song sparrow in the South Bay, and Sassoon song sparrow in Sassoon.
And I have another question here, which is, it's very encouraging to hear that it appears that wetlands are more resilient habitats than others. You mentioned that at the beginning of your talk. Why are other areas not as resilient?
Well, like for example, some of the shallow water habitats, like the say the salt ponds, as sea level rises and those levees become overtopped, they're just going to get deeper and deeper. So those salt ponds, for example, aren't going to raise elevations. So only tidal marshes can do that because they're receiving sediment every day as the tides come in and laden with sediment, and that sediment drops down, builds on the surface, and it builds up. So that's why we refer to tidal marshes as dynamic, and the fact that they can keep pace with some level of sea level rise.
How can we help participate in Point Blue's amazing work as a community?
Yeah, there's a few ways. I would encourage you to go to our website and just kind of look to see what opportunities there are there. There are volunteer opportunities listed. Let's see, what are some of the other ways? We often do bird walks and other nature walks, but those have been a little bit cut back during the pandemic, so I don't know exactly where that's at now. Another way I forgot to mention, that million shorebirds in San Francisco Bay. One of the ways we know that is through a volunteer-led effort, the San Francisco Bay Shorebird Survey. And it's an annual survey that's uses volunteers. So if you've got some shorebirding expertise, that's a great way to get involved, is volunteer for that for those surveys.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's other opportunities like that.
So they could just go to the Point Blue website and look and see what's available under volunteer opportunities, and then the shorebird survey. Those sound like two really good options. Yeah. I have somebody here that wants to know, are there government agencies that are focusing on wetland restoration also? And are there nonprofit organizations dedicated to restoration, which would be similar to Point Blue, I suppose, that we can support? So
yeah,
Point
definitely.
Blue, yes.
All of these all of the work that I presented was the result of many agencies, organizations, friends of groups, over a number of years. It takes a lot of work to do even just a single tidal wetland restoration. So I definitely didn't make that point in this presentation, but it's certainly not, that's not something that we do. We're not the ones breaching the levees, or we do the science, and we can advise how best to do it to benefit birds. The exception being the straw program, which does actual on the ground restoration. But no, some of the big players in tidal wetlands restoration agency-wise are the Fish and Wildlife, the Coastal Conservancy, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Those are some of the big ones doing restoration. And then other nonprofits, well, like Save the Bay. That's that's their one of the things that they're doing, especially, and they do a lot of transition zone work as well, and and a lot of cleanup and a lot of and protection. They help buy some of those larger areas, again, in partnership with others, because no one entity can usually afford to, buy these large parcels. Ducks Unlimited does a lot of work in the North Bay. They're a really great partner. We work with them a lot on restoration projects. Same with the land trusts. So they tend to buy up parcels and get grants to restore them, and then they turn them over to the Fish and Wildlife, for example, other government agencies for long-term stewardship.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's what they. Okay, so the Fish and Wildlife would have the long-term responsibility of overseeing. Oh, okay, that's interesting.
I mean, not always, but that's often what has happened. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. I have somebody here that would like to know the impact of restoration on insect populations, especially ones that people, maybe neighbors, consider them annoyances, but maybe they're a food source for birds and they're
Right.
also annoying. But is that an important part of your restoration, because they serve probably as a food source?
I mean, I'm not going to say that insects aren't important, but it's not a. There are definitely other, more pressing considerations. Like, I mentioned a few, like the flood risk to adjacent properties change when you open up an area to tidal wetlands. That's like just thinking like, huge issues versus, the insects. But one of the big issues with insects, of course, is mosquitoes. That always needs to be taken into account. But in general, tidal restoration improves the mosquito situation, in that mosquitoes don't breed as well, they don't reproduce as well in tidal marshes, in part because the water drains out twice a day. It's empty, and also it's very salty, and not a lot of species of mosquitoes can handle that. You get mosquito issues in marshes that are kind of semi-tidal, muted, where the water is allowed to pond, it doesn't fully drain out. That's when you get a lot of mosquito issues. Right. Or if you're trying to restore a site where the channels have been messed with, and so there's not a lot of good drainage, then you can get areas that are ponding that shouldn't really pond, and that can breed mosquitoes. But yeah, otherwise, other insects, I don't know if the question is talking about like going from a dry farmed area and then introducing tides. I wouldn't say there's any issues with insects in that case. But I will say that walking through a tidal marsh, there are billions of insects in tidal marshes, mostly spiders, small ones. But it's pretty amazing. And you don't really see them until you really, you squat down and look, or you do a sweep net to collect them. And I did that for a project way back when. I actually had a leaf blower, and I inverted the leaf blower so it actually sucked up and strapped a pantyhose inside the leaf blower and kind of sucked at the vegetation. And then you close up the pantyhose and you see what you get. And I was just blown away by how many spiders live in just a small, like, square meter area. It's pretty incredible. So now I know what all those song sparrows eat.
Okay. I think that's probably what the person was, interested in knowing, because somebody wants to know at least one significant nature-based adaptation that was used at Sears Point during the wetland restoration project. I know you can't get into all of them, but
one of the important refuge at Sears Point. So, like, are you talking about those mounds at Sears Point?
Yes.
Yeah. I haven't wandered around in that site much. It's not one of our study sites. I know that those mounds do get used a lot by shorebirds during the winter when they're the most plentiful. I don't think they have quite enough vegetation to support any of the study species that I showed, rails or song sparrows or anything like that. I do know that some of those species do occur on the edges of the marsh of Sears Point, because some of those edges are already starting to get some tidal marsh vegetation, and that's typically where it starts. So some of those edges are getting used. But yeah, the mounds specifically, not so sure.
Yeah.
My money would be on Canada goose. I'm sure they're out there using those mounds.
Yeah. Is that those mounds were put there as part of the restoration?
Yeah. Kind of for two reasons. Well, one main reason, which was to provide a wave break. So that site is really big. It's like over 1,000 acres. And it's also positioned kind of east-west, which is right in line with the prevailing winds. So the fetch from the wind waves that are generated from one end of the island, by the time they get or one end of the site, by the time they get all the way to the far end of the site, those waves are pretty big, and that stirs up the sediment and prevents some of that deposition that is so important for the marsh colonization. So those mounds were placed in order to kind of break up that wave energy.
Oh, okay. I do relative to refugia. I have another question, just asking about could you comment on the importance of it and what our community could do to improve areas? That would be one area that maybe would be within our ability to restore, that might have really a benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And that could be like a whole, and is a whole other talk that I've given on high tide refugia. Kind of the most simple answer is, well, it involves two types of refugia. And one is the transition zone that I did talk about. So that is important and does get used. And that's probably where your group can have the most impact, is looking for areas that could be restored, those transition zone areas. So yeah, they're relatively easy to get to. The permitting to do it is a little bit easier. And there's just more opportunities to do that, because every wetland has an edge. Even if it's really steep and small, it's worth restoring. The other category would be within marsh high tide refugia. And so there you can have natural high tide refugia. So some of the older marshes, the topography of the marsh kind of undulates a little bit, and especially in the areas right adjacent to a channel tend to be a little bit higher elevation. And that supports gum plants and other taller growing plants that can provide high tide refugia. But in the absence of that, like especially young restored marshes that are pretty flat and high and low and get completely inundated during a king tide, one of the new things that the community has been trying, specifically the Coastal Conservancy and the invasive Spartina project, has been constructing marsh mounds. So mounding up mud in the marsh plain, planting it with native vegetation, that gum plant. And then, so during king tides, those become like little islands of habitat in the marsh. And that's another thing I'm actually studying, to see how those things work, how, like, if they're beneficial are the birds using them? Are predators also using them? Is there any conflict between the rails that use them and the predators that use them? And how can we make those mounds, better? Is it better to have lots of little small mounds, or better to have just a few large ones? Questions like that I hope to answer in the coming years. But those would be harder to get involved with directly, because it's in the marsh, so it's more difficult.
And you're still studying them, I think, who's using them and what impact they have. Yeah.
Right. Yep.
Somebody, I'm going to give you two more questions. One person would like, could you define refugia? Somebody's not familiar with the term.
Oh yeah,
I'm just putting it out there.
Buzzword. Yeah. It's really just the vegetative cover. Most simply.
Okay.
People use it to mean vegetative cover that that remains during a high water event, like refuge from predators. Basically.
Right. Where animals can go, and if there's nothing there, there's nowhere that they can hide from hawks overhead, but they take refuge there.
Yep.
And my last question is: here in Marin, are cities and county governments considering how sea level rise and marsh restoration are connected? Do you think that, we're moving fast enough you think that is now something that's becoming part of the consciousness of our governments in terms
absolutely.
Okay.
I think, well, especially in Marin, which is pretty progressive on that front. They've produced quite a few planning documents, lots of vulnerability assessments, and like that. Well, that adaptation framework that I mentioned, the Marin County was a key, partner in producing that plan.
Right.
And provided a lot of those case studies. Where it comes to action, like actually implementing these nature-based solutions, those are a little harder to come by, in part because it's new. We haven't really done many of them. And so folks like the engineers don't necessarily know how well they're going to work. So they can be seen as a little bit experimental in that sense. And then also, I will say that in a lot of, for these nature-based solutions, to where they really excel is when you're talking about larger tracts of land, where you can really look at the whole picture and say, okay, well, here we need to do this here and that there. And often that crosses jurisdictional boundaries. So it makes it really hard to implement those kinds of large scale projects. Even if you're doing it, even if you actually implement it piece by piece, you still need that large scale planning to happen.
Right, the coordination and the cooperation, the willingness to work together.
And the vision too.
Yeah.
And right now, we're unfortunately still in a position where a lot of jurisdictions, counties and flood protection agencies and, sanitation districts are, who's responsible for what? That just, that is not ironed out, is not well known. And so that can really prevent, like, no one really wants to step up and say, oh yeah, we'll pay for this. So some are, I don't mean to like slam everyone, but it's just the way it's set up. This makes it difficult to implement the kinds of projects that I'm talking about.
Well, Julian Wood, thank you so much for coming tonight and sharing all of your experience and expertise with us, and for all you do with Point Blue to improve our wetlands and oversee them and try to have them be healthy for future generations to enjoy. And
thank you.
Yeah, and
I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was really very interesting, and I think everybody that was present tonight would agree with me. And I'd also like to give a shout out to our webmaster, Alan Shabbatz, for all that he does behind the scenes to make these webinars and Zoom meetings look like they happen so seamlessly, when they can assure you there's a lot going on behind the scenes that you don't see that results in presentations like this. So thank you very much. And I think everybody has a lot of resources to maybe continue or get involved in participating in being good custodians for our wetlands and doing something in their own way to support these endeavors.